Hello, and welcome back to Dev Game Club, a weekly podcast in which two veteran game developers look at games from the past to discuss their relevance and impact today. I'm Brett Duville, and I'm joined as always by a co-host, a man who has all day been humming the lyrics to Dirty Water.
Tim Longo. Now, you warned me that I may not catch that reference, and in fact, I did not. So.
Yes, well, last night the Boston Red Sox, in fact, won the World Series.
Oh, boy. Yeah,
okay. That's the song they play at Fenway when they win. Yeah. And they were kind enough to play it in Dodger Stadium. Anyway, we'll set that aside for now, even though I could spend an hour just talking about the World Series.
No, we're not doing that. No, thank you very much.
And
congratulations, though.
Thanks. I feel like I was a big part of it. Uh-huh. Go ahead and introduce one of our guests. I'll get the other one.
Yeah, we are very excited. This is one of our guest podcasts. We just finished this series on Thief, Dark Project, just last week. And so we were very fortunate enough to get two guests on. Our first guest, game designer and game director, Randy Smith, extraordinaire. And so to talk a little bit about Randy's background, from 97 to 2000, Randy actually worked at Looking Glass Studios, and he took on various roles there. He worked on Thief as a level designer and Thief 2 as well until 2000. And then moved on from Looking Glass to Ion Storm, company we've also talked about and played some of their games. And he worked as the project director actually on Thief Deadly Shadows, which is sort of the third in the trilogy, if you will. Although maybe it's kind of its own thing too. I guess we can talk about that later, Randy. And then after that, actually moved on to do various things, including working at Electronic Arts as a creative director there, collaborating with Steven Spielberg on an unreleased project there. But then also became a freelancer as well as a consultant and even a monthly columnist in the UK Edge magazine, which I read every time. A lot of good stuff there, so seek that out. And then most recently was one of the co-founders of Tiger Style, which is a largely mobile game company, award-winning mobile game company for Spider, The Secret of Bryce Manor, as well as the follow-up, Spider, Rite of the Shrouded Moon. Both excellent mobile games. I think the ultimate example of great design on that platform. And the first game was award-winning and nominated for IGDA awards, the Game Developer Choice Awards, etc. And now he's a freelancer and a game designer for hire, as well as other things. So welcome to the podcast, Randy. We're really happy to have you on. Brett, over to you for Greg.
Yes, and our second guest tonight broke into the industry through audio, which is appropriate considering where he worked up until recently, and how he has spent a lot of his spare time over the last few decades. The earliest credit I could find for him was working on music for a title on the Sega Genesis called Bimini Run by New Vision Entertainment, though he also appeared shortly after doing music work for Looking Glass titles System Shock and Flight Unlimited. Ultimately, his experience led him to act as product lead on Thief, the Dark Project. And he has continued in games through his work at Harmonix, where he was involved in any number of titles, starting with Frequency, continuing almost up till today, including a stint as VP of Product Development, and most recently finished his career there as the creative lead on Rock Band VR. Of course, we all know him even better as the bassist for Boston alt-rock pioneers Tribe. He is, of course, Greg LoPiccolo.
Nice.
Hello, gentlemen. Welcome to the program.
The Bimini Run reference. That's deep.
I thought I learned a lot from my bio, but Greg, I really learned some things.
Brett prides himself in those deep cuts. He searches long and hard for those. And I actually neglected. I missed Waking Mars. I apologize.
Yeah,
Randy. That's another great game that Tiger Style did. So yeah,
that one also won awards.
Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, both of them really
That's
good.
That's true. Yeah, some IGF work there for sure for Waking Mars.
Can't wait for Tiger Style's next stuff. So yeah,
thanks, guys.
So welcome to the podcast. Yeah, we're definitely we as you guys know, we take 4 episodes usually and play deeply through the game in question. And kind of around Halloween time, we kind of play something a little bit on the spookier side. So Thief fit the bill here. But obviously a big heavy topic is sort of what Thief brought to the table. But before we get into that, maybe we do like to kind of start off, especially because our audience tends to like to kind of hear how people kind of got into the industry, as well as sort of like what inspired them to kind of, and what their early kind of jobs were like, especially at Looking Glass specifically, because we talk a lot about that studio and its influence on the industry in various ways. So Randy, maybe start with you on sort of like your early days there and kind of your early career.
I'm going to step away from the mic for just a moment. So have at it, Randy. I'll be right back.
Oh, I was going to role play with Greg too, but okay.
He was involved. You can't do your scene now.
We can fit that in. I'll be right back.
Right. So, when I started in the games industry, there wasn't like what today are these very valuable college programs you can get into to learn not just programming, game-specific programming or game-specific art and so forth. So that wasn't available to me at the time. And, games just seem like this crazy thing that is like, there's groups of wizards in the wilderness, and in theory you could be one of them, but how would you know how to go do that? It's like, but I had friends who were like, this is what I want to pursue. And I was like, you know what? Me too. And so when I went to college, it was for programming, primarily computer science. And then I sort of kind of cobbled together my own games career. This is back in the 90s. I graduated from high school in 92 and then college in 96. And so then I cobbled it together with media arts, which basically meant like using Photoshop and, editing bays for VHS tapes, and psychology. And psychology and programming in particular are a pretty good starting place to be a game designer, And of course I had been a big gamer, not just video games, but board games and so forth, throughout all my life. My family is a big game playing family. We play cards almost every single time we get together, like normal playing cards usually. So I graduated from college, and then I got kind of like a normal person programmer job, and I was sort of like casting about the entire games industry to figure out what company I wanted to work with. And like, this is the Ion Storm Dallas, which is distinct from the Austin studio that I eventually wound up working for. But like, they had their big like Suck It Down campaign, which controversial. So
we talked.
This is like kind of the heyday of the like super toxic masculinity games industry time. Not that everything was like that, but I was looking around at companies like that, and a friend of mine actually, who now is a very senior designer and extremely talented, Nate Blaisdell. He and I went to high school together, and we're in a band together and stuff. I went to visit him at college, and he was like, "I've been playing this game. This like Myst was out at the time. He's like, I've been playing this game, System Shock." And like, he fell asleep, and I was up till like 6 a.m. in his college dorm playing. And I was like, I need to work for this company. Like, isn't that kind of no longer a question? So, and at the time when I was looking for jobs, the Thief, the Dark Project website had just gone up. It actually didn't have the name Thief yet. It was just called the Dark Project. It was like thedarkproject.com. And again, we're talking 96. So websites were exotic and bizarre, And this is a really amazing teaser website that it was like all black, and it just had like an occasional image and like tiny little snippets of evocative image building text that were, all flavor and like eight words long. And I was like completely hooked. I was like, I loved the tone. I loved the darkness. I loved the idea of stealth in this like rich fantasy world. And these are the guys who made System Shock. And I was so excited. So I had a list of all those companies I might work for. And there's just like at the top, it's just like this company. And so I really wanted to work for them. I had applied around to some other companies and gotten, lukewarm responses. And I basically cold called Greg LoPiccolo's, this is where we'd be role playing, like the phone on his desk. Like I tracked down, hey.
Hello.
Hey, we're role playing.
Greg.
It's okay, Greg,
Come
go
on,
again.
do it.
Hi, don't
Greg.
hang up.
Can I
My
help
name is
you?
Randy Smith. You've never heard of me before. I really want to work for your company. I'll drive myself down. I'll pay for the interview. Just come meet me. Let me do this. No.
Oh, where are you from? Vermont? You're from Vermont? Oh, you're hired.
So it was kind of like that. I literally did cold call Greg, and he was gracious enough to be like, cool, send us your materials. And then they put me through some tests and stuff. And then I finally got started working there. And didn't look back at the list of other possible companies in the slightest.
That's awesome.
In my opinion, the best game developers cold called for their first interview. I cold called Tim Schafer, so that's my own. I
don't recommend it for future.
No, it doesn't work anymore. But at the time,
not a lesson for modern day. And we didn't role play that call when he was on. That's too bad. We missed that opportunity. At the risk of taking a quick step back, if you will indulge me, when you were playing System Shock, do you remember kind of what was what was sticking out to you? Like what was getting in your head as far as like,
I mean,
this is
I think, and this probably
what about
played a role in me, meeting the requirements to get a job at Looking Glass. Like I was deeply invested in both the immersion, which is what a lot of people respond to, the fact that the game, sort of like had an invisible fourth wall and was inviting you to believe you were really there, right? But also I was very interested in player ownership, like the idea that I can, it's a big world of freedom and I can level up in different ways and approach problems in different ways. It's like, the opposite of String of Pearls linear design. And those are things that I was really passionate about, and I felt like they were doing better than anyone else. And I think I was able to speak about that in my interview. And they were like, yep, you're kind of one of us. I actually remember this moment in Thief 1. It was like one of the first things that happened during development is we got in a big crunch cycle, and we were working on Craig's Cleft, which was our demo level, and we had to like make great to prove to IDOS, our publisher, that they shouldn't kill the project. And, there's a lot of late nights and hard work. And I remember at one point, people were crowded around my desk. I started kind of as a hybrid programmer designer, and I had like made the gears that like, when they're smithing hammers or whatever with cauldrons, I had like made them turn back and forth correctly relative to how nearby gears were turning. And I remember Greg looked at me and said, yep, it's a Looking Glass game. I'm like, I think that means I'm doing something right. I don't know.
I think it was intended as a compliment.
That's a great anecdote. Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, and how about you, Greg? What was your intro into it? I would guess, if I can hazard one, it was probably through your bandmate Eric Brosius, but I might be wrong about that. So by all means, set me straight.
No, the order is kind of reversed. It was I was friends with a guy named Rex Bradford, who has a kind of like a super early legendary history. Look him up. He did a bunch of the Activision games, in the like 70s. Anyway, he was a friend of mine, and I was in this band Tribe, and actually Rex did Bimini Run, and so he hired me. I was like the musician he knew, and so he hired me and my friend Tim Reese to do that soundtrack, which we just kind of had fun with. And then I went to have lunch with him at Looking Glass. This would have been 93. I don't remember when in 93. And I met Doug Church and Dan Schmidt, both of whom were sort of, into the local music scene, and they knew my band, and they knew who I was. And they were just putting together, System Shock was in pre-production, and they sort of said, well, would you be willing to write music for a game? And I was like in this band, and it was a signed band and so forth, but I was like starving to death. I had I didn't have a job or really any money. And so I said, sure. I just started doing it as a freelance thing. And so I did a bunch of the early sound effects work and started writing this interactive score as a contractor. And then the band broke up like a year later, and things were getting busier and busier and ramping up. And so I went to Looking Glass and talked to Ned Lerner, who was like the co-founder, and said, you really need a full-time audio guy. And he was like, you start tomorrow. And I was hired. So then I was like the Looking Glass sound guy. And then they started working on Terra Nova, and that was too much work for me. So I recruited Eric. Actually, let me back up. Before I ever recruited Eric, I recruited Terry, who was the keyboard player. So Eric was the guitar player in Tribe, and his wife Terry was the keyboard player, and she had a great voice. I thought she was a great singer. And when we were trying to cast Showdown, I was like, I think I know who that is. And I, reached out to her. I was like, would you play this like malevolent, evil, insane, AI? So like a female HAL 9000. She's like, yes, I would.
Yes, please.
Yeah. And she killed it, and
yeah, absolutely.
So that was the first, that when that got going, then, it was sometime around the same time we brought in Eric to start writing all the music for Terra Nova. And then he basically just like ran with that, and had his own career in games, which is still ongoing as we speak.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Terry is frequently best known for her, role as a voice actor, but she's also a designer and a writer, and she did level design in Thief 2. She's a frequent collaborator, a favorite of mine. She's great to work with.
Awesome. What about if you guys if you mind shifting over, let's talk about Thief specifically. I think we touched on it a little bit in one of the early episodes, but when it comes to there's sort of the I guess the history of how this project came to be. There's a little bit of myth behind it, I think in a good way. It's sort of like what it started as and sort of the early pitches and even just sort of, we talked a lot about the full commitment to the Thief fantasy and how the systems and mechanics ended up really focusing on that and it being kind of a diamond in the rough of around first person games at the time, which, System Shock was doing, Looking Glass was doing things in this ilk, but just it was very unorthodox at the time. But do you guys remember any of those early stories about Thief specifically getting kicked off and kind of what it was started as and what it evolved into? And
I do to some degree. I'm a little bit. I live in fear of getting it wrong and then having somebody on the internet correct me. But so there was a couple threads. One was like, let's build this sword fighting simulator, and really try to get hand to hand combat right. And then there was a bunch of R&D that went into that, and it was a very difficult problem. And then there was also this thread of, everyone was really proud of System Shock, but when System Shock hit the market, it got crushed by Doom, and which came out pretty much at the same time. And I think my recollection is people at Looking Glass were a little crestfallen because we killed ourselves on that game. It had so much stuff jammed in it, and this other game. Which is, admittedly a genius game, but it was way simpler. Outsold it by 50 to 1,
Right.
Yeah.
John Romero, and John Carmack were driving around in Lamborghinis, and we didn't have Lamborghinis at Looking Glass. And so there was, and the, it seemed like the design takeaway was like, this game is too complicated, because that was a hard game to play. It was that the controls were obfuscated. It was pretty, you really had to commit to it. So there was very much a design thrust of like, let's try to simplify things. Let's reduce the number of variables. So there's this sense of like, still a commitment to immersion, but like trying to shrink the set of metaphors down to something where it was like going to be limited but rich. Like, let's attempt less, but do a better job with what we do attempt.
Yeah,
and that was and that was the beginning set of conversations. And then for the life of me, I can't remember how it evolved into the stealth idea. I assume it was Doug, but I could be wrong.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. No, there was, I think the myth goes a little, I don't know if it was from Paul or Neurath or Doug or what have you, but, that was the clincher for us of just like that particular. Did you guys have any other stealth oriented? I guess the truth of the matter is, from a genre perspective, and that's what we talk a lot about. There were not a lot out there. So I was going to ask kind of if there were any influences on that from any kind of perspective, but maybe not. Maybe because Metal Gear came out in this year. Right? It was 98 as well, I think.
Yeah.
We played that on the podcast too, but
it was very much, because I remember there was like a lot of design conversations that went on really for months and months. And I remember a lot of conversations trying to work out the mechanics of like this idea that you would be weak, and that you would control the world, through observation, and that we would need AIs to have sense perceptions and then communicate the results of those sense perceptions, and just like figuring out a lot of that stuff kind of on paper and in conversation, and it being like a new thing that would be really cool. Like a different way to interact with an environment, like, oh, let's do something different,
Yeah. It was just such a bold, especially with your Doom story. That's a good point. We didn't assess out the timing of System Shock and Doom at the same time, but it's an interesting tidbit of sort of the mentality of the studio at the time, having come off of that. And it's interesting, the simplification point. We also played Ultima Underworld on the podcast already as well. Kind of in that lineage, and kind of talked about some of the, obviously an earlier version, but some of the same players working on that game and some of the complexity there. But And Thief, our memory, though, Brett, maybe you did the research on it, I don't remember, but our memory is that Thief did pretty well, didn't it, once it came out?
It did, yeah. No, it was, I think, by Looking Glass standards, sales-wise, it was quite successful. I mean, not at the level of mega titles like the id titles, but yeah, it was profitable. It got a sequel, I mean.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It just was such a bold, we talk a lot about how bold it was, especially, and we talk about Doom specifically as a counterpoint to that, and kind of how brave it is to do something so different from anything else, because obviously Doom clones ended up being the thing for so long. And this was sort of, jinking left instead of right, and against everything else. And so, and then influencing whether probably obviously not planned, but influencing so many other stealth games. Do you remember any of those? You mentioned some of the conversations. Are there any anecdotes about sort of the stealth mechanics themselves and like how people were thinking about those or developing things?
I remember, I think it was Doug and Tim Stelmach, well, specifically Tim, writing a bunch of documentation that, got a fair amount of attention about the idea of this space being kind of the commodity that you were sort of trading in. There was dark space and bright space and loud space and quiet space. And that a lot of the level design was going to have to be about, parceling out that space and making sure that the player could, perceive what was going to be safe and how to get to safety. And that, that a lot of the game design was going to be different from that perspective, just in terms of how, the physical space, your perceptions mapped onto the physical space in terms of hearing and seeing. Which was a different way of thinking about it, and exposed all these new design problems. I remember us building little test beds and so forth with pools of light you'd walk through, and trying to get the AIs tuned that they would notice you at the right amount of brightness, that kind of thing.
That's an awesome way to put it. Yeah.
Yeah. I was going to actually turn and ask Randy about what he remembers of how the tools helped to centralize around that idea, or whether they did, or if it was more of a just sort of you had to know that going in, and kind of how that informed him.
By tools, you mean our in-house editor Drummond?
Or whatever else you were using at the time.
That was what we were using. And what specific problem? Like the light mapping in the environment?
How you had to, how much did the tools help you with that space issue, and also sort of you get, as Greg's pointing out, you get two types of spaces to think about: loud versus quiet, and bright versus dark. That
wasn't formalized in the tools at all. The tools were, in a lot of ways, just by being kind of old fashioned, would be what are familiar to people if they work in any 3D space editor or renderer these days. We would place blocks and carve shapes out of them and add other shapes, and then hang lights in the space, and it would, we'd put textures on surfaces and it would look like a castle, and that's how it worked. We'd build it. Also, we built it out and wait around for 15 minutes, but you don't do quite as much anymore. But so it wasn't like the ideas of bright or dark spaces were native to those tool sets. And I think there are times at Looking Glass where the design ideas, percolated pretty well amongst the team, and there's other places where that wasn't as active a thing. And so I think a lot of us on the the level designers for Thief 1 worked with our spaces and tried to get a feeling for what worked well and what didn't when we watched other people play test, or when our QA staff would report things to us and so forth. I think we probably all in some way re-derived some of those ideas, but I remember there were some levels I was less comfortable with, even throughout all the Thief games, but 1 and 2 in particular, where I was like, man, this is really a hard space to read. Some of those were my own, or at least I was the designer responsible for getting them across the finish line. The one that comes right after Act 2, the spoiler alert betrayal that happens with Constantine, and then you wake up, was Escape. Mm-hmm. That's the name of that level. I didn't build Escape, but I was responsible for tuning the gameplay, and I always felt like it was a little bit too punishing with it. And in some ways, on this axis you're talking about, it was all kind of monochrome, and it was well, what's a safe place to stand here, and what's a challenging space to stand here?
Yeah, we will agree that was a little punishing.
I'm responsible for a lot of the punishing levels in those games.
Yeah, it's funny. I was looking at there's one of the wikis obviously has which designer worked on which level. And yeah, a couple of our hot topics that you didn't listen to the episode, so you wouldn't know. But yeah, they revolve around your levels, sir. So
cool. Well, I've grown as a designer since
then.
no,
you have. Hopefully all of us have. But I've made the same mistakes. Yeah, so the Greg, to your point, the description of sort of the economy of the space types is really interesting. We didn't describe it that way and pick up on it, but I guess I'd never heard it described that way, and it's really good, cool way to think about this, the way that the systems and mechanics work with that, and with level design specifically. And I mean, I guess a little bit back to Randy on the level design side, like how do you remember sort of how the evolution of those sorts of, like, I don't want to say necessarily best practices, but like, pillars, if you will, or sort of rule sets that you as the level designer started to surface as you started fooling around with those rule sets? Was there anything that surfaced, or was it kind of just a lot of experimentation and iteration?
It was a lot of experimentation. We had best practices in my time at Looking Glass, when Greg and I overlapped on Thief 1. But a lot of our, we were wrestling with some pretty thorny rendering technology and stuff. And we had to, there wasn't such a thing as sound propagation. The Looking Glass engineers invented and implemented it during this project. And, there had been dynamic lights in games before, but not that also impacted gameplay, that the AI had to be able to measure in a way that matched the player's perception of lighting, which, if light is just passing through empty space, you can't see it. But if you stand in it, then you should be seen by guards because you're in a bright spot, and that's how the engine natively worked, but that isn't clear to players. And, there's just a ton of problems we're solving, many of them technical. We had to optimize for polygon counts and separated room spaces, kind of like you still do to this day in Unreal. We had to put in these brushes that we called room brushes, which are basically, here's a room, and this other thing isn't. So don't let sound propagate from here to there because that's actually a solid wall. So there's a lot of that best practice, because if we didn't have it, we wouldn't be able to ship the game at all. And we haven't mentioned this much, but right. One of the pivots from Thief 1 to Thief 2 was to really double down on the stealth stuff. That we felt more comfortable with the idea that the player was vulnerable. We didn't feel like we needed as many zombie and monster levels where you had a sword and you did battle face to face, because there was a fair amount of that present in Thief 1. I forget where I was going on that tangent. Oh, right. So I think over the years and over the projects, I think I became, and certainly this is through communicating with other folks and great designers in the studio, but I started to sort of codify more and more rules about how to build great levels in Thief. And then I was able to hopefully present those to the Thief 3 team when I wound up leading them. But in Thief 1, I think we were just kind of winging it and doing our best to survive.
Yeah.
There was another aspect of development on that project that two things that I remember clearly that were really challenging. And one was that until all the systems were stood up and worked, until you had AIs that could perceive the space, and you had light and dark and sound and all that stuff, and enough feedback coming back from the AIs, the whole bark system, it basically sucked until a day it was awesome. Like a lot of games you work on, they sort of there's a linear path where it's oh, now this works and now that works. No, it's getting better. This was no, it was pure crap until the day that it was brilliant. And we never knew when that day was going to be, Yeah. We were just basically just digging a tunnel. It was like digging the Chunnel, and trying to meet the other side. You were just digging and digging for months and months and months as all these complex systems got stood up. And it not being fun and not even being demonstrable. You couldn't even show anybody what was going to be cool about it. You could describe it until it all, got over that threshold. And then we're oh, this is going to be great. And then we had not very much time left to make the game.
Yeah, it's a game that seems impossible to build a vertical slice for, right? That's a sort of term that came about right around that time, maybe a few years later. And simulation games are really difficult to do that with, because you need everything for it to work. Yeah.
And the other thing that Randy alluded to a little bit is the rendering engine. My recollection is you could have about 400 to 500 polygons on a screen at a time. And so you had to be crazy disciplined about, just your viewpoints. I actually remember something I do remember out working with Randy. He's it's okay, Randy, build us a level. And he was I'm going to do a cathedral. And I was like, okay. And you're going to be in the inside, you're going to be the outside. How are you going to, like, you know, get across a cathedral with 450 polygons? And I remember it being a struggle, and then he pulled it off, and it's in the game.
I built it 3 times.
Yeah, okay. But because I remember, like, bringing up that concern, and then, you know, and then having Randy, like, bang his head against it, and then get there ultimately.
Yeah, we were behind schedule at one point, and I was like, Greg, I have to build this level again from scratch. And you were like, I think I warned you about this. I'm like, yes.
You hear that, kids? 450 polygons.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, and we built these very organic spaces like city streets and caves and waterfalls and all this stuff. And a lot of the trick was there's a couple of tricks. One is what I like to call the Emil Pagliarulo, who's now with Bethesda.
Yeah, former colleague of mine.
Yep, and his way is just slapping those sloppy brushes and just make it work, make it look good, and keep every space small so you don't tackle these problems. And then there's the Randy Smith, I need to build a cathedral, which is never going to be a small space, where you just have to secretly make a bunch of things line up, like, which is actually convenient for it because, you know, turns out that a lot of architecture is symmetric and lines up on purpose. But, you know, it's sort of like in the city streets, it might look like this one tower is totally independent from this other, you know, balcony down the street, but secretly they share a bunch of different planes so that the renderer would break them up in a clean way. That kind of thing was happening.
Those are tough. Those are tough things to manage.
It's not the most fun thing to spend your energy on, right? Like, we were designers who were kind of having to be artists at the same time, and in my case, not a very good artist, and what it should have been focused on more is gameplay. But, you know, I think we all agree Thief came out pretty good despite that, and I think it was because of this looking glass ethos of putting the systems first. Like, in a certain sense, despite the fact that the best levels do have these rhythms of, you know, territory that are, you know, hostile to the player or you know, friendly to the player, you know, you could just build anything and play the game. Like, you didn't need to mark it up with what was good and what was bad. That was systemically read from the space that you built, you know?
Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
That's a fundamental shift. Yeah. That definitely people take for granted, you know, for sure. Especially when you play an older game like this, where you just assume, yeah, that's why we love talking about the simulation aspect of these games, for sure. Greg, I'm always interested to hear, I guess, kind of a 2-part question for you. One, can you, for the audience, I think, talk a little bit about what your role was leading the team, and how, you know, how you did that, and kind of some of the tips and tricks. And I think as a segue into sort of when you were in that, I'm always interested in that ambiguous phase where everyone has sort of this this goal that they know on paper, like you said, you know, you've designed it out, and you think that the fantasy and the simulation is all going to work together, but it takes time to get there, and then you get to that magical point. But how did you lead the team through that sort of time? You know, I think a lot of people, you know, wonder about that, and I'd love to hear this side of it.
Oh boy, you know, it's funny. I wonder if my perceptions of it line up with other people who were on that team. But thankfully, we have one of those people. I was handicapped in as far as, like, I was not a deep game guy, and I had not been at Looking Glass since, you know, '89. Like a lot of, you know, like, you know, Mark and Tim and Doug and some other folks, you know, had really been there from the beginning, and I had not been. I was like the sound guy. So, and I wasn't a coder or anything. So there was a bunch of just like disciplinary stuff that I didn't really understand. So I was like, felt like I was coming from behind a little bit. And you know, it has to be said, like, that team was like crazy talented. Oh my God. There was like so many unbelievably smart people on that team. So the things that I remember doing, I remember having very strong opinions about the narrative and how like how we wanted to present the world. You know, in terms of like, I remember like pushing this idea of like, let's write tons and tons of stuff and then not necessarily use it. Like, let's not name the city. Let's not have a linear plot. Let's just like spin up all this lore and then use that as like the encyclopedia to draw from, to write the, you know, the journal entries and the NPC dialogue and so forth. And that I thought worked.
Yeah, no, that's
really proud of it.
That's cool that you mentioned that. because we talked about that, and it really. Sorry to interrupt, but it definitely shows that because we talked about lore a lot, and it definitely feels like a deep lore game, but it was very disciplined with its use of that. But it still felt genuine. So yeah, sorry to interrupt, but continue.
No, there was this. I remember, like, that's a thing I remember, like, trying to champion was this idea of, like, you would never know, because there was a lot of, like, the Ultimate games, or a lot of like great games that were pretty much, you just march through and you read the cutscene and then but it was like, it was a story that was worked out for you to experience. And it was already like the Looking Glass way that, like, we weren't going to do that. Like, people were going to make their own stories. And then there was this question about, like, well, how can we do that, but still have the story be sort of rich and idiosyncratic and have a lot of personality? And that was the method, right? Was to, like, work out all the backstory and then just have all these things that if you didn't encounter it, it was not a big deal. Like, just like lots of ambient detail. And we didn't really know if it would work. And it did. I mean, different people, I think, responded to it differently. Some people didn't care, just blew through and collected their loot and, went on to the next mission. And other people got really into it. And so that was kind of satisfying to see that at least some, and then we were also saved, I think, by the quality of the voice writing and the voice acting for a game of that budget. I thought we were punching way above our weight,
Totally agree.
I think a lot of that,
especially of that time. Yeah.
First level, you hear the bear pits dialogue. That was like, I loved that. It was so good.
Classic.
Yeah. It was like, it was well written and it was well acted, and it was, compared to what most games were like at that point,
Yeah.
And then,
and
sorry.
The other thing that Brett and I talked a lot about is especially on the VO side, is because of the telegraphing and messaging that needed to happen. VO ended up being a really critical part of the NPC gameplay loop as well. So not only was it written and acted well, but it became critical to understand sort of the state of things, And so it was something that not only that you wanted, it was. You needed to listen to it because you wanted to know when two guards, for instance, were done talking, because you knew they would go onto patrol. So there was a utilitarian need for it. But then also it was great. It was just fun to listen to because they were great characters, and bear pits and, and all that kind of fun stuff was mentioned. And so it put you into the world as well. So it was like, for me, it was just a great convergence of all those things in one package, all pushing in the same direction, which is, to be honest, often rare to have all that stuff work together so well. So it's a small thing that I think, obviously hard to do, but I think people kind of overlook that a little bit.
No, and then there's like little details of the things I remember about the game. Like, I haven't played the game in, a really long time.
20 years.
Like, things about it, like, I remember, like, the Hammerites, there was one who was like a complainer, and he'd walk around and he'd, like, whining about, we had to do all the work, and it was like the voice acting was fantastic. Like, there was all these characters that poke through that I thought were, like, really witty, and and that's really a result of Laura and Terry's writing, and the acting, a lot of which was, some of which was the team, and some of which was people like Stephen Russell, like pros who did a great job. And I guess the other thing I would say about that I remember about leading it was when I started, there wasn't a very organized sense of game production. I remember having to learn Microsoft Project and build a Gantt chart to actually, like, build a project schedule. It's like, okay, that's a thing that people do. I guess I should do it. And so I learned how to do it, and I did it. And that was, I think, the first time we had an actual, project schedule that said what the tasks were and how long they should take. And then, of course, we didn't hit that, but I remember putting, doing those kind of like production heavy lifting.
Yeah.
And then a lot of the rest of it was like staying out of people's way because they knew what they were doing and they were good at their jobs.
Right.
I mean, there are definitely the dark moments when we, that window of time Greg's referring to, we're able to make the game have more content in terms of like levels and spaces. And have it look better. Like we improved our art and textures, and the lighting engine went through some improvements and so forth. But that was the only visible progress going on. And then we were kind of waiting for these invisible systems to come together in the way Greg described. And I had always, maybe just from naivety, but I had always had complete faith in the project. And I'm like, obviously, this is a great game and we're going to finish it. It's going to be very successful. But I think a lot of the rest of the team, and, Looking Glass had gone through some difficult times right around now, just before, there's a story about just before I arrived, how they were like going to repossess the plants because they hadn't been paying for them or something. Like,
It's true.
And
there was a day they came in and took all the plants, and we were like,
oh man,
you don't pay for the plants, they take them back. So
if you're losing your plants, then,
right. And so I think the more senior members of the team are like, dude, we really have to get this together, or it is not going to ship. But I think the way Greg held the light through that, he's, he was a role model for me when I started as a junior designer. He was like incredibly articulate and able to, I'm still a rambler, and I would say many, many paragraphs of things. And then Greg would say, yes, in 4 words, what you said. And I'd be like, oh, and that vision and clarity can be a real torch through hard times. Like, we're just going to do this. We're going to get there, and then we're going to see what it is. And here's what we're up to. And that's, in a lot of ways, that's the role of a team leader and a director, to be like, here's where we're going.
Well, you're very kind.
Mm-hmm.
I'm glad that worked out that way.
How about you, Randy?
So yeah, I like how you just took all of what Randy said and said, "Well,
Right?
you're very kind,"
Right?
and condensed it right down to those 4 words. That's
We're
great.
still
Perfect
role
example.
playing. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, you scripted this whole thing out. I see. Randy, what about you on level design, sort of the role for you and process? And I'm sure obviously it evolved over time because this was your first level design gig. But
I mean,
how did you approach things? And when you wanted to make a cathedral, like where was that coming from? And
it was a dream come true in a lot of ways because, as the industry matured and process and, producers became more rigorous in their requirements, which is a really intelligent way to run a project. It was more like, this is what you're doing. And here is, this document's been through many stages, and it's been approved by the art staff and all these other people. And here, now you must do it this way. And I kind of walked in and there was a thief, like 1-page story summary, which I believe, Ken Levine had at least put his stamp of approval on the end. I think he's credited with authoring it, but I would know for sure if that was true. So that was kind of like the deep backstory of the 3 factions and that kind of stuff. And then there was a basic arc, like a 3-part story arc for this game in particular. And then there was whatever it was at the time. I think it was probably 18. And we, as always happens, you cut a third of the levels, and we wound up at 12. But 1 to 4 page documents that were here's what this level is. And so, I got a document for Return to Cathedral, for example, which is the level that was my baby level for Thief 1, the one I spent the most time on. And it was hey, here's the deal, man. You came back here, and there's this eye, and there's a curse, and the place is haunted, and secretly the eye's trapping you. You got to get out with the eye. Okay, anyway, good luck. Dusts off, hands, walks off. And I was like, cool. Well, and I just invented the entire cloister in the back, and the subplot of Brother Muris, the dead Hammerite priest, and I got to decide how the trap worked and stuff like that. So in a lot of ways, it was a dream, right? You got to come up with cool ideas and try them out and see if you can make them work with the tools. And, our scripting language was basically the underlying game programming language that was exposed. So it had enormous freedom, and there's a lot of things we could do. And I was really good at getting myself into trouble with it. So that part was awesome. And then, as I said, there was a lot of just placing geometric brushes and texturing them and realizing that you're over your polygon limit and trying to figure it out, and a lot of the technical problem solving. But the creative part was really fun. And I think, especially because I was such a junior staff member, they were so accommodating and so willing to hear my ideas and sort of channel that fresh, junior enthusiasm, which is a lesson I've taken into my career. I've been, 20 plus years as a game developer now. And I always like to have very junior folks on them. They have that, fresh perspective, enthusiasm.
Yeah, agreed.
It's fun.
What about
just to respond to that briefly? I remember sort of over time coming to realize that was one of the things I thought was really special about Looking Glass, is it was really shot through in those early years with people who didn't, weren't really aware that you couldn't do this or that.
Mm-hmm.
They were just attempting things that were in retrospect seemed insane, but they pulled them off, because they were yeah, we'll just do it, it was, which was great. And you don't see that so much anymore. I'm sure there's little teams that still do it, or I'm sure there's games in development right now where people have that attitude. But I remember that was the only place I had ever worked. And I didn't really realize how special that was until years later,
Yeah. Brett and I talk a lot about that. I think in a lot of the series that we've done, because a lot of the games have kind of fallen in around the sort of same decade range so far. Some of the classic ones we're playing, and he and I both have also been, since the 90s in the industry, and this sort of trend of risk aversion in the industry overall, and Looking Glass was really one of the studios that was laying the groundwork in almost kind of an indie spirit way like we have today, and I think a lot of the bravery is in that space more than anything, because they're just going to go do it, like Randy was saying, and like you're saying, there's like, well, we're not afraid to try something, because what do we have to lose? Let's just do it, and yeah, it's kind of, I miss those days as well.
Well, it's interesting, like Thief was also a very conscious attempt. Again, I'm telling a story that I wasn't present for in retrospect. A conscious attempt to be more commercial and more accessible, right, Greg?
No, absolutely. Yeah. It was like, oh, we're going to make a game that's really easy to play. And,
right.
Which like it's like slightly funny looking back at it. But if you compare it to like, Underworld or System Shock, I think it was successful in that regard. It was, somewhat simpler and more streamlined.
Right.
Than those games were.
Well, and I think focusing, again, like we talked about on the top, focusing on the Thief fantasy specifically and everything that comes around that was a great, versus sort of like a deeper RPG or something where you have a lot of different options in those, in some of the other examples. I'm interested, Randy, if you, or both of you, if it makes sense, one thing that we talked a little bit about that is always fascinating to us with these sorts of simulation-based games is sort of I guess what I'll kind of glom together in sort of the iteration process, tuning, balancing, sort of using the tools that are given to you from mechanics and systems once they started coming online. Like when if you take the Cathedral or something, like how did you iterate through? Of course, this also was a game with a loadout, and so when it comes to accommodating all the different things the player could bring to bear, to get, play your level, how did you tune and balance your way through that? What kind of, was it just, again, kind of like endless iteration, or were there any conclusions that you were kind of raising about how to do that?
Yeah, I mean, there was a fair amount of tools that were useful for that. So we had, an object hierarchy, which are pretty common now. It's like, if you develop in Unity, it's like your prefabs folder. And if you have one object that inherits from another, that's a thing you can do in Unity, I'm pretty sure. Yeah, sort of. You have to set it up a little differently.
Yeah, but, it's similar, yeah.
Yeah. But we had this like extremely, hierarchical system where like the very top object was just called object. And that meant like, the game engine has a handle for it. And then if you drill down to like chair, it inherits from furniture, which inherits from inanimate, which inherits from physical, and then whereas an AI would be totally different, path through this big tree. And at every branch of the tree, it got more properties. And so we were able to edit that hierarchy directly, add new objects, add children to objects that is like, well, this one's just like this other rope arrow, but it has this other change of quality or whatever. And some of that you didn't want to get willy-nilly with, but it was definitely a good way to like create our own behaviors and have it so that other designers could grab them and put them in their levels, and we could create conversation about that. And then the way we developed is we had a main monitor that had like the game and the engine running in it, and we had this tiny little monochrome green and black CRT text only monitor to the left. So, I mean, if you've never seen such a thing, imagine you're in a submarine during the Cold War.
Really? That's awesome.
I totally forgot about those. You're right. Yeah. Okay. Go on.
You didn't live through it. It's fine. I can never forget. No, it was cool. And it would just like spew diagnostic information at all times. It was basically like the console in Unity, right? It was like whatever a programmer wanted to bug fix that week was getting spewed down there. But, I worked, for example, I paired with Tom Leonard, who is the lead programmer and who is responsible for the AI and all of its locomotions and behaviors and pathfinding and all this difficult stuff. And, that thing was like my Bible. Like we would work together to make sure the AI was functioning correctly. And, when an AI in Thief isn't behaving well, you have to know exactly why it decided to do the thing it's doing. And that thing would be spewing diagnostic information. I would like start over and try a different thing and, figure it out. And we could use that thing to do reports on levels. We could say like how many, of which type of crystals there were. So you could get, resource balancing done that way. And there's a bunch of stuff like that. When it came down to it, though, and this is, I think, one of the reasons my levels are hard, which is why it required growth for me as a designer, is like a lot of it was just watching people playtest and playtesting myself. And, I think the trick to a lot of these games, and in a lot of ways, the fundamental trick of game design in general, is that it doesn't make sense to a new player the same way it makes sense to you. Like, where Escape is a great version, like that level's very hard, and it's because I knew which path to go down, and so as a game designer, if you want to be talented, you also have to imagine being a player who doesn't have your information, doesn't speak the same language that you do, didn't build the level, can't see the map in their heads, doesn't know what's expected of them, doesn't know what's going to come around the next corner, which in Thief is a huge problem. You could be in a totally safe stretch of hallway and just like proceed one tiny little step at a time for no good reason because you don't know that there's no guards that patrol in this hallway. And so you just have to have that very broad awareness that like lots of different people come into this problem and they all see it differently. And you're trying to communicate with them secretly to let them know, give them suggestions about what they might do, what options are available and how to proceed. And so that's a great, like if you're a very senior designer and you just iterate through your own level, you can probably do a pretty good job with this. But as a junior designer and also probably without enough iteration, I think that's kind of how a lot of my levels wound up hard, is you just kind of had to know what I was thinking to do to beat them as easily as I beat them. And I carry this is lesson forward. And like Tiger Style, when we shipped games, we would start playtesting them easily a year and a half out from ship. And we would have like weekly playtests pretty much all through development. Like it was always never good enough. We wanted everybody to have an easy time figuring out what was expected of them.
Yeah, empathy is a huge fundamental skill for game design. We definitely talked about that on the cast, how, and in particular with Escape, just saying, look, you get to a point in development where you're really good at your game and you know everything about what you're building, and it makes it very hard to know that this is going to be a potential wall mission, or something people aren't going to get past.
Also, maybe it's like wasn't really your mission and somebody just assigned it to you to clean up someone else's work and you didn't have your own on it.
Yeah.
That could happen.
Yeah,
I mean, that's hypothetically.
Right. We're kind of closing down a little bit, but and Brett, sorry, I'm kind of monopolizing questions, so just interrupt me. One of the things we do when we finish up a series is we kind of talk about takeaways as we've gone through, and kind of like as developers, but as gamers as well, and kind of like key themes or key lessons. It can be anything, but really just takeaways. And maybe you mentioned one there just now, Randy, for yourself, but I'm interested if either of you can remember something that from Thief specifically you carry with you now today as a developer and leader for games. Does anything come to mind that for your own kind of personal takeaways for Thief?
I mean, I think one of the ones that I've learned both from Thief, but also through the years, is that when you're working on an innovative thing, people are just going to constantly be telling you it's not going to work. And I think you need to listen to those people and figure out what they're skeptical about and figure out what you can do to address it, but they will never be happy enough. There's as a group of people, like, there's always going to be a handful of them who will just never come around and never believe. And you cannot let this derail you. Like, if you believe in the thing and you think it could come together someday, you have to keep on, despite the fact that there will always be people who are pretty actively trying to push it down. Because they think that's the best thing to do. I'm not trying to criticize them. I think skeptics are important for this kind of innovation. But you have to make that balance where you figure out how to listen to them, but also how not to listen to them.
Yeah, to kind of follow up on that, I think that there's kind of this growth trajectory for for at least some developers, where like your first stage is the stage of like, hey, we can do anything. Look, this engine can do anything. And then you kind of get slapped down hard as you realize how little you really can do. And then there's the phase of like, I'm going to be responsible and say no to everything and shoot down everything because, you're never going to get fired by being, cautious or conservative, or whatever, that like poking holes in things. Because it is hard. It's like so hard to make games. It's ridiculous. And so generally the kind of people that I've had the most fun working with are the people that get out of that stage and have this balance of like, no, it's going to be hard, but we're going to do it, anyway.
Those are awesome.
Yeah. Terrific. We want to give you at least a chance to, we talked a little bit in pre-show, and we know neither of you are in a position to talk specifically about what you're up to. But we thought we'd at least give you a moment to talk here at the end about where you're hoping you go next, or that sort of thing, or anything you want to kind of push or what have you.
Randy?
I have to go first.
You must.
I must. So Tiger Style is not currently making any new games, and I've been doing freelance work to pay the bills since then. And then sort of in the background, I've been cooking up ideas that I've had sort of on the back burner for like over a decade now, for sure. And I feel like I've been pretty, like, as I look back in retrospect, I've been pretty good at keeping my finger on the pulse of what's going to be new in games, whether it was sort of like when platformers had a big comeback or survival games. I was sort of interested in survival games before they became big, or, you know, like I look at those instincts and I feel pretty good about them. And mostly the entire space has now been explored by indie development. And there's just this one corner that I'm super passionate about that I've loved since a little kid, before I even dreamed of being a game developer, that fell by the wayside over 20 years ago. And I think it took some turns in wrong directions. And I just really believe in this format. So I put together a pitch for like maybe what would be a good first installation of trying to do this. And I can't talk about more than that. I know that was probably unfairly tantalizing with no details, but I do hope, like, in about a year from now, that maybe this project will have been funded by somebody who's wise and foolish enough to believe in innovation, or just doesn't care about getting their money back. And that is public enough that we
and hopefully doesn't listen to this podcast.
Yeah, no, do not listen to this podcast. Talking, but you know, in super short, it's kind of low fidelity in a lot of ways. It's 2D and simple, but it creates because there's not as much concern with whether foot sliding is happening and whether animations line up with attach points. It allows it to simulate more sophisticated human interactions and character behaviors and character dialogue, and that's the space I'd really like to pursue more. Totally not flashy, but hopefully interesting simulations.
Interesting.
Cool. How about you, Greg?
It's just to respond to Randy's thing just briefly, is like, one thing I think is kind of nice about now is like there's always going to be sort of the, you know, Red Dead Redemption 2 kind of like, you know, behemoths, which are really amazing things, but that there's enough people, enough like, you know, people with taste in game design, so that you can go out, you know, you can go explore some dark corners of game development or game design and find an audience. Like, I'm always like, you know, shocked and kind of like in a good way about, you know, these indie developers put out these little things that have like this amazing, you know, heart to them. And then they find an audience and they do okay, you know?
Yeah. We definitely talk about that indie spirit a lot, because a lot of the, obviously, like I said earlier, a lot of the classic games we're playing, you know, we're taking risks that seem to be harder, like we talked about earlier. And one of the good things about the expansion of the medium and the audience broadening out is, there's more people to find those nooks and crannies. So yeah, it's a good time. It's a good time for that.
I think, you know, because it always sort of seems like it's a bad time, or at least a lot of people think it is. And I guess in a lot of ways it is, but there always seem like these, like, you know, every year there's a few things that come out. They're like, wow, I never would have thought of that, you know, that are like amazing. And so for me, I guess my thing is, I'm going to be about as specific as Randy was. I've had, you know, through my entire kind of harmonics career, which I, you know, had tons of fun there, and, you know, it was great, but there was always like a lot of those games were really good at making you feel like you were a musician, but they weren't really great at making you be a musician. And I still feel like it should be possible to make an interactive experience. I don't even know if you would call it a game necessarily, where you could use software to sort of impart musical concepts to people where they are and give them agency, so that people could actually like walk themselves up a skill curve, you know, in a kind of a game context, and make their own music. And so that's kind of what I'm working on.
Awesome.
Oh yeah. Very tantalizing. Yeah, that's great. So now I'll be definitely watching. I've said on the podcast how I used to keep really close tabs on what all the games are coming out at any given month, and you know, I played this Thief when it came out. The day it came out, I was crushed over my monitor at work. And now I'll be doing that with whatever you folks are working on. I'll be keeping my finger on that particular pulse. So thank you for that.
Hopefully we both get funded.
Good luck.
Good luck to both of you, and I want to thank you so much for coming on. It was a pleasure to play this game in such detail and really talk about it. And we're really lucky to have been able to spend some time with you this evening.
Well, thanks for having us. I had a blast.
Yeah, thank you guys very much. Good talking to you.
Welcome back from the break. That was a fantastic conversation.
Yeah. Having both, I was really a treat because I didn't tell this while he was on, and we didn't really have time. But I met Randy just randomly at a roundtable in GDC, like in 2000 or something, and we were both kind of at the same place in our careers, both level designers. And I don't know, we just like literally were just sitting on the floor of this roundtable and hit it off, and that's literally how I met him. And then we both kind of went on in our careers from there. But it was great to reconnect with him. He's a super. Obviously, I haven't followed Greg and I don't know Greg well. He seems also professional and veteran and awesome. But Randy's a really good designer. He's a really really thoughtful person to follow. So for the audience out there, definitely keep an eye on Randy's stuff.
Yeah, I've absolutely loved all of his Tiger style work, and what I have had heard about Greg. Beforehand was just like that he was a peach, that he was just one of the nicest guys in games, and
good
that's
leader,
borne out by that conversation for sure, and some great stuff in there. I'm glad you asked about the sort of leading the project sort of question, because I was trying to find my way there, because I knew he'd been this audio guy, right? Like, how does this guy end up running a project? And of course, because it was the 90s, right? Is part of the answer. But also, I mean, it just sounds like he's really very thoughtful about that. And whoever was making that decision, I think probably made a very good one, because you can hear the respect that Randy has for him as well. Yeah. So,
Randy. Yeah. And I definitely trust and respect Randy's opinion, so he's, calling him a mentor and stuff. So that's really cool.
Yeah, high praise for sure. Okay, well, so let's talk just a second about next week. We're hoping to have another interview next week, also associated with Thief.
It's still looking good. Yeah.
Yeah, still looking good. We haven't nailed that down, but we will. If for some reason that changes, we'll let people know via the Twitter account that's at Dev Game Club. And I'm just going to do one email this week because it focuses in on Tim in a couple of ways. This was sent to devgameclub@gmail.com. It's from Kevin Brown. The subject is latest episode, Halo conversation. He says, "Gentlemen, enjoyed the last episode, of course. No question or anything, just a story. Part of this ep that made me laugh the most was when the conversation turned to Halo. When Brett commented that he had no desire to co-op the last level, it took me back to the time I played Halo CE. What's CE? Something...
Combat Evolved, dude.
Oh, I forgot that. Okay. Last year co-op with my daughter. We have an Xbox One. I thought it was like the re-release. Anyway.
Yeah, it's a common mistake.
Yeah. We have an Xbox One and Xbox One X set up in adjoining areas, so we each have our own screen, and we just yell back and forth at each other as we play. It's very much fun. First two sections go good. Our version of co-op isn't terribly cooperative in the strictest sense, though. My daughter is pure run-and-gun mayhem, and I'm slow and methodical. It seems to work well for the most part, except I get tired of, Dad, where are you? I'll just wait for you to catch up. She's being a bit impatient because she's determined that we beat the par time for the level, something that I never worry about. Little did I know how impatient my daughter could be. Hit the final section jump in a Warthog. My daughter drives because she always drives, and I take the turret so I have something to do to pass the drive ahead of us. So off we go, driving and blasting. She rolls the Warthog, and we go flying. I look around and see her run over to the Warthog and flip it over. I shoot a couple flood, then turn to get back in the Warthog and man the turret again. I see the warthog driving away. My daughter has abandoned me. With a bit of profanity, I express my dismay. My daughter just says, "See ya, Dad, only one of us has to make it to the end for us to get part-time." And off she goes. You know how pathetic it is to be the Master Chief just walking down a long hallway all by yourself? Occasionally I'd come across Flood to shoot, but that was it. Just sad and lonely John 1:17 walking along by himself. Yeah, my daughter got her part-time. I still bring this up to her. "Dad, want to fire up Halo? So you can leave me again? Alone in a tunnel with Flood? Only if you're too slow. I'm sending an invite. Love gaming with my daughter. Currently co-opting Far Cry 5. Keep up the great work, guys. Love the podcast, Kevin." Yeah, I thought that was great. Yeah. I would have saved it till Father's Day, but it was connected with a recent episode.
That's awesome. Yeah, I could see that coming. Yeah, that's great.
Well, it was a lot like my experience, of course, but in the original, so we played couch co-op, Andrew and I, when I was talking about that, Andrew Kermsey, who was a programmer on Starfighter with us and a friend for 20 years or so now. But in the co-op version, the couch co-op version, split screen, if you got left behind, you teleported to whoever was in front. And so he was driving the Warthog. And so I'd be like trying to run to catch up and I'd teleport to him, but then the Warthog would just keep driving. So I'd like drop down behind him. So it was just like tempting me the whole time of like, oh, you could be here with me, and I'd get left behind again and again and again. It was torturous. But I can totally see this experience, with a younger person.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Good times. Yep.
Yeah. So no questions in there, but I knew you'd appreciate that.
No, I love it. Yeah. I just, as he was describing it, I could just, the tension was mounting and I knew exactly what was going to happen.
Yeah.
Especially with her play style, which I think is great. I just love that. I love the visual of how her play style, contrasts his, and just playing co-op that way is just so great.
Yeah. Pretty good stuff. All right. That's it for us this week. You can, as I mentioned before, you can shoot us email at devgameclub@gmail.com. And of course, you can also follow the podcast on Twitter at devgameclub, where you can also find Tim at
Tim Longo Jr. with the JR at the end.
That's all we have. Have fun playing games, and good night.
Good night.